Teaching a single course in ecology in a school of public health obviously raises difficulties. There are two kinds of strategies that are usually followed. One is to give a survey touching briefly on all the various topics. The other one is to do a sampling, to concentrate on 3 or 4 specific problems and hope that that teaches you something broad. My own preference is what I refer to as a sampling in depth. That is, we deal with specific problems partly to represent the whole. So we'll go into a certain amount of depth, for instance, in agriculture. Not because all of you are going to work in agriculture, but because there are principles of agriculture which are relevant in a much broader way. Some of these are relevant because of the biology, the question of pests, of soil fertility, erosion, questions of that kind. Some of it deals with the history of agriculture, how people make a living from farming, what the different structures of agriculture economics have been, what agriculture has been like over the last 8,000 years or so. Now, we've been engaged in agriculture for a relatively short time in our history. And during that time, we've had an enormous impact, not only on the rest of the world, forests, climate, and so on, erosion, but also on ourselves. That is, as a species, we are very much subject to the environments that we create. For instance, it seems as if in the transition from a hunting society to agriculture, people actually got smaller. Nutrition got worse. And you see this nowadays. There's the field of archaeology, of public health archaeology, or paleontology. So it's now possible to look at the past. In some cases, we are able to find out what people died of in the past. And the reason for this is that some diseases leave their marks on the skeleton, on the teeth. About 6,000 years or so ago, arthritis appeared. Rheumatoid arthritis appeared in the Midwest. And you find these in the burial sites of the mound builders in Ohio. Tuberculosis came into the Americas through the Middle East. And that's related to the fact that in the Middle East there were cattle. And it spread over from cattle to people. In the excavation of grave sites, we're able to see something about the epidemics, the spread of plague. And there are other things that you can learn about it other than how many people died. You can ask the question, at what ages they died? Were people equally vulnerable at different ages? Nowadays, it's possible to do an analysis of DNA from the excavations of grave sites, and you can ask questions whether the flu of 100 years ago had the same genotypes as the flu at the present time. So, as part of public health now, we are able to look at the archaeology and the paleontology of disease and ask questions, what made people vulnerable? Perhaps the biggest outbreak of disease in human history has been the invasion of the Americas from Europe. The people of the Americas were vulnerable to European diseases. There were no real native cattle in the Americas. In South America, you had llamas, but you didn't have domestic animals for the most part. And so when diseases came in from Europe, the peoples of the Americas were extremely vulnerable. There was massive mortality. Well, so there's a book, A Pest in the Land, is a survey of the diseases of the Americas after the introduction of the microorganisms, primarily from Europe. Right, so there are historical aspects of this sort. There's another kind of history that becomes important. With the beginning of agriculture, there's a surplus, and there's the division of society into classes. Now, before that, hunters and gatherers did not have class societies. There was a certain amount of stratification. There were successful hunters and less successful hunters. But in a basic sense, everybody made a living in the same way. That is, if they were chiefs in a clan, the chief made a living like everybody else by hunting or fishing. In the Pacific Northwest, you had peoples who were fishing. The longboats of the Kwakiutl, the Tinglet, and so on, were rather large enterprises in collective fishing. And the environment was rich enough so that there was a surplus. And the surplus was then divided up among people. Sometimes you throw a big party. Because one of the problems with the surplus is that it's not always easy to store. In the Southwest, people could grow corn, and they were able to have a surplus in corn that they could store for about 3 years. And this was a protection against the droughts and the famines that affect the southwestern United States. But the important thing is that about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, society begins to divide into classes. By classes, we mean people who are related to production in different ways. They are able to take part of the surplus for themselves. Sometimes they take on the role of redistributing the surplus. We know something about them because their grave sites are different. The grave sites of the rich had ornaments, sometimes animal remains. You also had the beginning of construction of houses of different sizes. And it's usually interpreted to mean that the large houses were the houses of the rich. This is not necessarily so, because it may even be that the large houses that we find in excavation were ritual sites, storage places. So the interpretation of the past can sometimes be quite difficult. We study the succession of different societies. Now, whereas in dealing with animal life, we tend to think of a species as essentially uniform. There are tigers, and tigers have a tiger way of life. And we can study tigers, we can study the remains of tigers. With people, this is no longer the case. There are social classes. And with social classes, the division of production is going to be different. People are able to have different occupations. Now, whereas previously, let's say everybody was a hunter, once you get the development of class society, there's ownership. There's ownership of land. There's a development of tools. There's a division of labor, such, for instance, that you have the appearance of soldiers. There are sailors with the beginning of trade across the Mediterranean. And so we can go back several thousand years and find sunken ships. In the sunken ships, we find flasks of olive oil. So from these kinds of studies, we get a sense that people began to do different things. And because they were doing different things, they were subject also to different kinds of illnesses. So this is the beginnings of class society. We get different kinds of health problems. People in different classes are vulnerable to different diseases. It's the cholera epidemic that hit the Caribbean had a very different effect on slave owners from slaves. The slaves were much more vulnerable because of poor nutrition. The mortality was higher. There were massive die-offs of the people who did the work on the plantations. So once again, with the development of class society, people live in different ways. Their habitats are different. So now, there are societies in which there's a division of labor according to class. And even though there are different classes, historically, it doesn't mean they're the same kinds of classes. Now, for instance, a slave economy had a particular kind of class structure. Slave owners made their wealth from the exploitation of slave labor. If they were interested in getting more wealth, they would do this by having more slaves. For the most part, they were not engaged in modifying the ways in which things are produced. They weren't developing machinery. They were not changing the means of production. So what they did was exploit more people. In medieval and ancient times, once again, the nobility owned land. And the way in which they attempted to increase their wealth was to acquire more land. Now the land belonged to the lords, to the royalty, and they would give donations of land to the next level of nobility. At this lower level, they were able to exploit the land, have serfs, have some hired military people. For instance, the knights in general were subject to the lords, and they were the contribution that the lords made to royalty for military purposes. But the knights also had to make a living, and they didn't always have opportunities working for their lord. And so you had a whole stratum in Europe of professional soldiers. Some of these professional soldiers received salaries, but for the most part, they made their living from plunder. Now what this meant was that they would tend to sign up with a captain if that captain has a good reputation for being able to bring in loot. So it was the loot that was the basis of the income of the knight class. There was the beginning of mercenaries as well. People who rented out their services. In the Middle Ages, the Flemings from Belgium, the Hessians in the American Revolution, and others who were simply professional soldiers. So you had different classes of people, but they were different from the classes of people we have at present. Later on, we'll be discussing the structure of capitalism. Capitalism, again, is a class society, but it's a different kind of class society. One of the features of capitalism is that production is for the purpose of sale. What that means is that it's no longer important if something is useful or not. The question is, does it have a market? Items are produced for sale, whether or not they're really useful. And so you have the problem that increasingly goods are produced as commodities. And we'll be dealing with commodities later on, whereas on a plantation, things were produced because they were used, because they were needed. Under capitalism, under commodity production, things are produced because they can be sold. And the question of whether they're sellable is somewhat independent of whether they're useful or not. So what's happening in modern capitalism is that there's an increasing range of goods that are produced for the purpose of sale. Now, some of these goods can be useful, but there are also goods, luxury items, goods for exchange for other goods, services, and the number of different kinds of services that are produced is also something which is increasing. Now, the problem under capitalism is that you start getting surpluses. And with a surplus, you face the problem, how are you going to get rid of that surplus? Well, part of it is producing new kinds of goods. And part of it is inventing services. So for instance, not only are physical objects produced for sale, but people's time. Services in the service industry, healthcare. In Brazilian newspapers, you can see ads for kidneys for sale. In the United States at the present time, you can get wombs for rent, surrogate parenthood. What's happening? Sex has become a marketable commodity. So what happens is that the number of commodities branches out, increases, and people are engaged in the production of commodities simply because they may be marketable. In the automobile industry, an important thing that happens is that variations on cars are invented for the purpose of being able to compete. They can be decorations, they could be gadgets, they could be ornamentation. But later on we'll get into this question of what is the consequence for human well-being of commodity production. In the course of industrial production, there are a large number of goods which are dangerous. Things like pesticides, cleansers, and so on. That is, they're sold because they can be sold. The number of such items increases. And we'll be dealing later with the question of how does this affect the well-being of populations when the number and kinds of commodities increases. So this is a way in which a class society is different from feudal society or a slave economy or hunters and gatherers. In all of them there's production, but production can take different forms, and the relations between people will be different. People have a division of labor also between production and reproduction. And the way in which women's labor is divided between production and reproduction is crucial in determining the status of women and the division in society. It also deals with the rules of reproduction, rules of marriage, ages of reproduction. Because the crucial thing to understand about human ecology is that the human is both social and natural. We are biological beings subject to our physical environment, transforming our physical environment. We're also social beings, relating to each other socially, through exchange, through service, through changes that we produce in our habitat. And throughout the course, it'll be important to be able to look at both of these kinds of aspects of human ecology.
Sorry, just going back a little bit. So what do class divisions look like for communities that weren't landowning societies or had feudal systems or slave economies that were none of these things?
Well, there's pre-class society.
But I mean, I'm thinking like pre-Columbian United,
Yes.
like the North America.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's like only a few hundred years ago.
Pre-Columbian society itself was extremely diverse.
Right.
The Aztecs migrated southward along the Rocky Mountains as a group of 3 more or less egalitarian clans. So they didn't have class division. They did have stratification. There were chiefs, there were priests. When they reached the Valley of Mexico, in the 14th century, class differentiation developed very rapidly. They developed a military, they became conquerors, they had merchants, farmers, rulers. So this was a division into classes. Now, not all groups were of that sort. The North American tribes, for the most part, were egalitarian. These are the kind you see in the Western movies. Once the horse was introduced into the plains by the Spaniards, it was taken up by the Native Americans, and you got these horse societies who hunted buffalo. Before that, they didn't. Before that, the buffalo hunt was much more difficult, and they also engaged in horticulture, in gardening. So at the edge of the plains, you had groups like the Mandan, who essentially had gardens. Further south, you had the Aymara in the plateau of Bolivia. They were agriculturists and herdsmen. They had llamas, vicuña, alpaca, but they also planted potatoes. Now, potatoes are an interesting crop. The potato plant needs heat, grows in the sunlight during the day, but it needs cold at night so that the starch it produced during the day will be transported to the roots. And because of this, because of the distinction between day temperature and night temperature, the ideal habitat for potatoes is the mountains. Okay. So the Aymara grew potatoes in the mountains. Trouble is that it can get too cold in the mountains. You can get frost. And so what the Aymara did was dig canals. Now the physics of a canal is such that water can store heat during the day and then release it at night, preventing the plants from being killed by frost. And so it's along the canals that you get the plantings of potatoes among the Aymara. Then about 500 years ago, there was a severe drought. With the drought, there was insufficient water, not enough to buffer the potatoes. And so they had to abandon potato cultivation and move further south, downhill in the mountains. So you can see changes in climate resulting in changes in people's agricultural activity. The Aymara are an interesting people because of their social organization. They're one of the very egalitarian societies of South America. The way decisions were made were through community councils. Everybody would get together and talk, and the discussions could go on endlessly before they eventually reached some kind of collective decision. The name of the town council is the Aylu, A-Y-L-L-U. They still exist, and they're the organization of social structure and debate. Debates can go on for weeks before reaching a conclusion. The Aylu is also the nucleus of contemporary Bolivian democracy. In Latin America, they've developed a form of democracy which is very different from political democracy. It's not organized around political parties. It's organized around reaching consensus. And because of this, in the present Bolivian constitution, these councils are recognized as organs of self-government. The council as an organ of self-government is the alternative to political democracy that's being invented in the countries of ALBA. That's Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela. To some extent, it may be developing in Paraguay and Peru. It's important to recognize that there are different forms of political system that are possible. And these are related to the way of life, to what people produce, and therefore how the kinds of decisions that have to be made and the content of these decisions. Any questions about this? Okay, so when the new government was elected in Bolivia, the inauguration was a grand gathering of the Aylu, of the Aymara people. Now, the Aymara are not the only people in Bolivia. There are also the Quechua. The Quechua came out of Peru. The Incas represented the Quechua. The Quechua were a more elaborate class society. They occupied regions of Bolivia, and they had an Inca empire that lasted for a couple of hundred years until the invasion of the Spaniards. So when you ask about Latin America, you have to think about very different kinds of societies related to their habitat and their way of life. The Maya are a group, not of a single people, but of a cluster of people with similar languages. The Maya prospered around the year 1000 up to about 1300. So they're another example of a civilization that had a finite lifespan before disappearing. The High Maya ending around 1350, I think. Now, one of the features of the Maya is that they did not have domestic animals. Therefore, they had very little ways of transporting things. As a result of this, the Maya kingdoms were very small. The Maya did not have military campaigns that could go very far because they would have to bring food along. And the only food they could bring is what individuals could carry. So they could have slaves who carried food part of the way, and then the soldiers would carry it further. But basically, the Mayan kingdoms were small. And the history of the Maya that you see in the old inscriptions are histories of conflict among these tiny kingdoms. In spite of the very small kingdoms, the Maya developed a very elaborate culture, particularly in relation to astronomy and in writing. So the astronomy was pretty good.